Hello and welcome to another Renegade Economist talk show. This week I'm with David Malone, author, filmmaker and journalist, and also the creator of book Debt Generation. David, thank you very much. Fresh from the House of Commons, talking to the good people of the Commons and discussing, debating. Debt generation, let's start with that. Who are the debt generation?
Sadly, it's you and me and our children. There is a generation, and we're it, who we are being left to pay off debts the way that we used to export toxic waste to third world countries. I mean, the banks have their own toxic waste and they need somewhere, some unmarked grave in which to dump it. And we are that unmarked grave. Just somewhere where they can say, this is bogging us down. If we have to dispose of this properly, we're never going to make any more money ever. So can't we just put it in some rusty old barrels and ship it off to some people who will have to live on top of it? Now, that's you and me.
And the rusty old barrels, obviously the debt, we are then building a civilization on top of that debt and hoping that it doesn't blow up. Is that
yes.
Is that the general idea?
Yeah, and that debt, it is toxic. I mean, it does eat away at the fabric of whatever country it's left in. You only have to look at Ireland or Greece or Spain or here. So it's not inert stuff. It has a real effect. I mean, if it was no problem, then the banks would be happy to keep it, wouldn't they?
Your logic may be a little too, scathing for this day and age, but it's refreshing to hear. What was the impulse when you thought, well, you know what? Because your background's is science, is it not?
Yeah.
And you're a filmmaker and you've made programs about science.
20 years of making science programs for the BBC.
So I'm going to give you a retort that we hear a lot of the time. But you're not a trained economist. David.
No, I'm not. No.
So what was the impulse to writing the book, and what is the advantage of coming at it as an outsider?
Well, I always think it's a great thing not to have been indoctrinated with pseudoscience. I haven't been trained in the tenets of classical economics. Neither have I been trained in astrology.
Or neoclassical economics.
Yeah, well, even worse. I mean, the assumptions of neoclassical economics are so risible that in any science they're just a non-starter. They are so fatuous that it's difficult really to know how to respond to those assumptions. They just don't work. So the reason I started writing about finance, and it's finance more than economics, because you quickly realize when you talk to people in finance, if there's one group that they snigger at more than the public, it's economists.
Let me quote you. Economics is a very muddled theology in service of a truly rotten God, and all they have done is dress it up in a lot of numbers.
Yeah, I mean, if you read, if you go to the economics journals, they have mathematics envy like nobody's business. Pages and pages of equations where this symbol equals that, and we're going to have delta the other. And when you boil it all down, it's gibberish, and it doesn't work. It's very much like St. Thomas Aquinas wrote, 12 volumes of the Summa Theologica? One of the most closely argued pieces of logic that Western civilization has ever produced. Yeah. It's completely brilliant, sadly, hardly ever touches on reality. And modern economics is the same. It's very much like that kind of Catholic theology of the medieval period. It's dressed up in a lot of Latin, specifically so that if you try and question it, and they go, you don't speak Latin, do you? No, I didn't think so.
And that's the classic trait of a guild, is it not? Where you keep all the. It's why lawyers and doctors spoke Latin, because you keep people out. But thankfully,
hocus pocus.
That's
where it comes from.
Let me quote you again. But the essence of economics is beautifully simple. But unfortunately, those ideas today don't touch reality.
Yeah, they don't. I mean, perfectly clearing marketplaces. For the theory to work, there has to be the knowledge base of all the people participating has to be perfect, and it all has to clear perfectly. Now, on an A4 sheet with lots of numbers, it can do.
But we're all rational, aren't we? Everyone's perfect. Everyone's rational, and everyone should do what economists say.
Well, I think in the end they're going to have to pass some laws to insist that we do act as Homo economicus. But people don't. They don't. And the world is not a linear place. I mean, mainstream economics is still living in a world which people in physics and mathematics believed in prior to about 1889, when the first papers discovering non-linearity came along. Economics is still not there. The big economic models that get quoted are dinosaurs from the 60s, and the mathematics they're using is from the 20s and before. And it's linear mathematics. It's as if the last century of mathematics didn't happen. And the economists are still going, I think if we just tweak this a little, it'll work. No, it won't.
Right. So the technocratic meddling at the edges, thinking that half a percentage point here and we'll do this. We know that it's junk. Right?
It is.
And you haven't had to unlearn the
I've nothing invested in that.
And you didn't drink the Kool-Aid of PPE at Oxbridge, for instance, or Ivy League. So you've come at it from an outsider. So where from here? Because if you leave it in the hands, I think it was the Archbishop of Canterbury, to continue the theology theme, he said that Rowan Williams said that economics are too important to be left to economists. So what now for this discipline, business, finance, and the wider world?
I think economics needs a reformation. You just need the populace to say, do you know what? I actually don't have to have the priest mediate this for me. I can look at this myself and have my own thoughts. I mean, that's what the Reformation was. I mean, there they decided something much more important in their mind than mere economics. They suddenly said, after 1,000 years of being told they weren't allowed to think this for themselves, only these experts could do it, they said, you know what, that's bollocks, isn't it? And the thing about economics, it isn't really that complicated. It's not really rocket science. I mean, if you talk to people, a friend of mine used to be a risk manager in one of the big European banks, and we have this conversation all the time. It's money in and money out.
Not that tough, right?
When you boil it right down, that was his job. He said they dress it up in the most extraordinary stuff, but hardly any of that is necessary. Even less of it is useful, and even less of it is good.
It's necessary if you're rent seeking and robbing the place.
Yeah, if that's your job and you get Lamborghinis out of it, I'd be keen on it too.
So let me just jump about, because really what we're talking about in Reformation and economics is reclaiming the cognitive map. And that's not about what's debated in public, it's what's left undebated, unsaid. And you talk a lot about the English Revolution. Just talk around this area, the printing presses, getting rid of intermediaries, new media, and the behemoth media that's in place that isn't serving the public in the way it should.
I'm sure you must have had this experience before. When you go to talk to people, at some point people will say, but can it happen? I mean, how could we change things? And I always say, look, the first and the greatest of all the European revolutions, the one that the French Revolution and the American Revolution all borrowed from, all of the ideas, and I do mean all of them, of those two revolutions, were all written by English men and women and all published within 400 yards of St. Paul's. That's just a historical fact. What happened is, up to that point, you couldn't publish something as an ordinary person because the Crown controlled the printing presses. There came a year when the Crown lost control of the printing presses. Now, again, it's just a matter of fact. The year or two before they lost control, when the Crown controlled it, if you wanted to print something, you had to send it to a representative of the Crown who said, not in your life, mate.
Yeah.
The year afterwards, 1,000 pamphlets or more. During the course of the English Revolution, 21,000 pamphlets, most of which have been saved. They're in the British Library. We know this. Written by ordinary men and women. And the other great thing that happened is the public house was invented. Suddenly there was a place where ordinary people could meet each other and realize there were people like them. I mean, they probably came from small towns and small villages or small enclaves where they would think, what do I know? Who am I? I don't know anybody else like me, which is what people today say. But they went to the public house, and for the first time ever, there was a public space where they could meet people like themselves and realize that ordinary people did have sensible ideas. And within a few years, a revolution started. And my point is, those people are no better than we are now.
why is our public house? Because there will be people watching this now saying, but David, a lot of our pubs are shutting down. And they're going to give you a stat, 96 pubs a day being shut down in the home
Quite
country.
right.
And they are. So where's the pub? Where's the pub?
Times have moved on. I would say that blogs, and mainly blogs, places where it's the same function. People gather together and they exchange information and they sit together and they read what each other is thinking. They do those same things. There are so many writers out there that they are the pamphleteers. They're the modern pamphleteers. I like to think that I'm one of them. And I'm just a bloke who writes in his attic in Scarborough. On the months when I write a lot, I get sometimes 20,000 people from over 107 countries, because I'm such a nerd I counted. And that's one. Scale that up by all the people writing about this. Many of them much more knowledgeable than me. And if I were the powers that be, I'd be starting to get worried.
If today you were to appoint somebody, in the royal family, the British royal family, who should be the person who should be reading, if we still had that in place, that they had to, who would it be?
Who they should read?
Yeah, no, as in, like, should it be Prince Charles who should be gatekeeper for the knowledge, or would you put Prince Andrew in, or would it be Will? Who would you appoint to be the man who said yes or no to any pamphlet? You don't have to answer the question.
It's so absurd.
It is absurd, right? So you're writing away in your little attic in Scarborough. Yeah. You're in good company. Alan Ayckbourn, he does the same thing.
Yes.
British playwright. And we're in this situation, and there are a lot of people around the world doing it, and there is that kind of discontent. I don't think what you're calling for is a bloody revolution.
No, I hope not. I mean, the 21st century, I really hope that we've got past that. But if there's going to be one, and it is a possibility, it will not be the fault of the ordinary person, because we're not the people closing the avenues to peaceable democratic dissent. The powers that be are.
Why?
They're rewriting laws.
How?
I'll give you one example. Bilateral investment treaties. Who's ever heard of it? Who cares? Was it on the BBC? No. Will it be on Channel 4? No, it won't be. Those laws, and there are now over 3,000 of them, they allow companies to sue nations for loss of earnings. Think about that for a second. This country, according to the Bank of England's own figures, has probably lost 100 billion in lost earnings because of the financial crisis. But can we as a nation sue those companies that caused it? No, we can't. They can sue us, and they do. No one's even heard of it, and we're about to sign 2 more. And once it's law, it's law. I mean, people worry about financial companies in particular breaking the law, and I wouldn't make light of it. They do, hideously, all the time, and they never get caught for it. Well, they get caught, but never prosecuted. But I don't think that's nearly as dangerous as when they write the laws. Because once they've written the law, they don't need to break it. They wrote the law, it suits them. And my worry is that how can you, once it is law, once it's the law of the land, what recourse do you have to say, I'd like this changed, please? When both of the major parties, and let's not even worry about the other one, singing from the same hymn sheet, where do you then go? And my worry is that if there is no avenue for the way we should be able to oppose this, then what are people left with? They either roll over and say, look, okay, I'll just tell my children that they can't afford anything, they won't have a house, they won't be able to go to university. I'll just tell them that it's all over. Are people going to do that forever? I hope not. But I would hope that we still had avenues, democratic and peaceful avenues, for saying, I want this changed. But sadly, I think they're closing off so many of those avenues that I think it's already the case that nothing will be changed by a reformist party. The era of reform is over.
So this is what happens though when citizens become consumers and people assume a consumer nature, because it's this mentality of a waiter get me, because someone else is looking after it.
Oh, garçon, where are my rights?
Well, quite. But so is anyone else looking after it? And what's your view on this area, the rights and obligations?
I don't like the whole idea of rights. I personally don't think anyone should have a right to anything.
Contentious.
Yeah, I do think they should have obligations. So in other words, I don't think you should have the right to be left at peace in your house. I don't think that should be your right. I think it should be your obligation to make sure that your neighbour is left peaceably in his or her house. And your neighbour should have that obligation for you. Everything that's on the Bill of Rights can be written as a Bill of Obligations. The only difference is it's very clear that if you want those things to happen, you have to do them. It's your obligation as a citizen. The Bill of Rights says that Father Christmas or the Tooth Fairy or the IMF or Christine Lagarde is somehow going to deliver them to your doorstep, and all you have to do is go, hello, my rights aren't here.
Christine.
Yes. I've known my rights. I should never thinking that maybe part of the obligation lies on them. So you end up with all the same things, but I just think we've got to get away from thinking that some mysterious third party is responsible. It's not. It's you.
I totally agree. I should be contesting this hard in a Paxman-like fashion, with an antler lock and lots of rutting, but but I agree. And I can't remember who it was, and maybe someone will put it on the comments. Somebody said that yes, there should be a Statue of Liberty, but on the opposite bank, the Hudson, there should be a Statue of Responsibility.
I love that. I didn't know that.
Yeah, and I can't remember who it was, but what about that? Because of responsibility, that ability to respond, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to the ability to be served, a wafer thin mint, and you just kind of.
I think part of it, just one of the many aspects of this is that I think people knew during the boom years that all was not well. Mm. But I think they just said, well, it's somebody else's responsibility.
I'm all right, Jack.
Well, yeah.
Was it that cynical? I'm all right, Jack, or someone else will look after it?
This is one of the things I get hot. One of the many things I get hot under the collar about is when people. I had this particularly in Ireland when I was there. Well, everyone took on loans that they couldn't afford.
Talk about that.
Oh. My question is: have you ever tried to take something from a bank? Have you personally? Have you gone into a bank and said, I want a loan, give it to me now. I'm here to take it.
You can't get a pen out.
Exactly. No one ever, since Al Capone, took something from a bank. They didn't take loans. They were offered loans by people who said, trust me, I'm a banker. I'm highly paid. I know that this will be fine. People accepted loans from experienced bankers. That's their moral guilt. They accepted them, but they didn't take them. There's a difference there. I think this whole notion that it was somehow our fault. Some fault was the ordinary person's, but it wasn't that we marched in there mob-handed and the poor little banker said, oh, okay, sorry, we'll give you some loans, against our better judgment. That we all know that's not what happened. But what I think we do have to face is that we knew that multiples of six of your salary was probably okay.
yeah
was probably not good, and the bankers knew the stupid things they were doing, leverage of 50, 60, absolute insanity. But everybody got into this notion of well, it's someone else's responsibility. It's the banker's responsibility to tell me that 6 times my salary isn't good. And the banker said, well, it's the regulator's responsibility to tell me that a leverage of 35, 50 or 80 isn't good. And we were all guilty of that. We had the obligation to go, actually, that's madness. And we didn't. Because we've got this notion that it's somebody else's responsibility.
Do you see, because it is a bleak picture, and of course, when people go mortgage mining, they try to offload as much debt onto as many people as possible, because fundamentally the bonus structure means that they get more money.
Securitization.
But do you feel that decent leadership will come back, or do you think we're past that point now in this tyrannous situation that you talk about, rewriting laws? Or will there be an inspired drive to say, you know what, we're not taking this anymore? Because because there is a service. We should be serving customers, and we shouldn't be serving our self-interest in this Randian way.
Yeah, well, that's a nasty question. I personally don't think we're going to get any leadership from the main parties.
Right.
I think the maiden parties long since have been cognitively captured. They just believe in that mainstream view of economics, and they bought into it.
When you say parties, you're talking about political leadership.
Political parties.
Right. So what about corporate leadership? Because we know now the corporates own the political party, or to be more specific about it, rent seekers own government.
They largely do.
So what about corporate leadership? Because surely the corporates know, this is a zero-sum game if we follow it to its logical conclusion.
Yeah, I mean, there are people, I speak to some of them who, as mothers and fathers, know something is really, really rotten. And some of them feel at least very conflicted. They know they're part of the problem, but they know it's wrong as well. So I don't think it is entirely monolithic. And there'll also be a period of cannibalism amongst the big corporates. I mean, I think we're coming up to one. I think we will probably, maybe next year, see a raft of banks being allowed to go down so that collateral can be liberated for the ones who survive.
Yeah.
I think when that happens, you'll start to see people who thought that if they played the game and kept their head down, that they'd be amongst the chosen, suddenly getting the creeping sensation that they've been had and they're not going to be part of the chosen. And then that becomes interesting. What do? Do they break ranks? And I speak to one or two bankers who are already at that point, who would like to say something but are not sure if now's the moment because maybe there's one more bonus in it for them. That's weird to have those conversations.
It is, and it's a weird mindset, isn't it? Because you think this house of cards is going to collapse. If I get one more out of it and then hit the exit.
Yeah, I mean, but that is how they think. That's genuinely how they think. Yeah. I mean, that has been the culture that only an idiot plays the long game.
Right, yeah. Well, that's the case, isn't it? And I mean, look at politics. Statesmen think of the next generation, politicians the next election. I mean, this is short-termism has killed nation states, really.
Well, what I would say is I think the nation state is dying,
yes,
but not because it's under attack from terrorists from the outside. I think the nation state is dying because the state has decided it would now like to work for someone other than the nation. We are being betrayed by the state. The organs of the state, which we think of, because of that phrase, the nation state, means us. I think they have decided they're working for other people.
Treason?
Yeah, it is treasonable. Yeah, it is genuinely treason. They are quislings. I think the nation is currently, every day, being betrayed by the organs of the state. Not everybody in the organs of the state, but very largely.
Where from here? We can't. We've got to depict the problem because we can't be Panglossian about it and say, "Don't worry, it'll all be fine." But you're getting popular comedians saying, "I don't vote anymore." You're getting news anchors at BBC Two agreeing with them, saying, "No, he's right," even though he's played the facade, on television. So where from here?
Well, I do think I agree that lending your complicity to a system which just isn't working, which you can say, well, that's what you do when you vote. I can understand people saying, I'm not going to legitimize this.
And that's the none of the above argument.
Yeah, but I think it's a protest which is quite vivid, and people go, no, you're right. All of these people are useless. But in a democracy, if you really want radical change, by radical I mean, from the root of the word, pulling up by the roots.
Yeah.
Either you do it democratically, or, I assume, you're laying in stocks of C4. Now, personally, I'm not. They're not going to give up their wealth and power. I mean, what is it? 10% of the nation owns, is it 50 or 60% of all the wealth?
It's more than that.
Okay, I was being conservative.
Yeah.
And they own more of the financial wealth. And that's the wealth that's being bailed out in the banks. When we say we must bail out the banks, we're bailing out the people who own the banks and whose wealth is in the banks. That's not you and me. I don't have any wealth in any of the banks. So they're not bailing me out at all. I do think we have to get beyond that. And I think the way we do it is by saying, when they say there's no alternative, that is the big lie.
So would you focus your attention on that? Because if you need a working surface, because what you've got is a formless enemy and it constantly morphs and you don't really know what, the battles you're fighting. So when you hear that, and you've done a huge book tour with Debt Generation, and you've heard all the responses, I'm sure, and I'm sure they're quite common across the board.
Yes.
Would you say that that's really an area to focus, that there is no alternative? Because your view is there is an alternative.
There's more than one. I mean, sometimes you may have got this where people say, so what's the answer?
Yeah.
And I say, look, if I had the answer, they'd have shot me already. Yeah. And anyway, I don't want to rush from one failed certainty into another one. The fact of the matter is, out there are quite a number of interesting and very plausible alternatives. And the only thing I would say is, don't listen to the people who tell you that there is no alternative. And even to listen to someone about an alternative means that the sky will fall in. It won't. There are other alternatives. There are very different ways of running a bank than the way we do. One of the reasons they hated Libya and Gaddafi is because he'd never been part of our banking system. Libya didn't borrow money. It had no debts. And they hated that. They hated him for that. He built the great man-made reservoir for 30 billion, and he didn't borrow it. Goldman Sachs was pissed, because if we'd done it here, we'd have borrowed it from Goldman Sachs, and they'd own it. Libya just did it. I'm not suggesting that we should vote for someone like Gaddafi. I'm just saying, in the strangest places, you will find things that worked.
And they become the threat. They do work, and they become the threat of a good example.
Yeah, and there are very good thinkers out there who are pursuing lots of different avenues of thought. It's a very fertile time. Just like, when the Catholic Church said, you can't think any of these thoughts. If you do, the world will end. And actually, there were a number of people thinking fantastically interesting things. And the world didn't end. The sky didn't fall in, and it won't now.
Wonderful. Well, look, congratulations on the book, because it's been a huge hit. And can I ask this question? Do people come up too quietly after you've spoken? Because we call it the corporate whisper. And they say, oh, yes, very interesting. By the way, you're right. And then because I think there are a lot of subversives in organisations in place. Yeah. And because as you depict before, people aren't happy with this. And they might be at Goldman or JP Morgan or all these places, but they know in their heart of hearts when they're going to rent seek.
There are two. They fall into two groups, and I've had both. There's the one that you describe, where very senior people will quietly say, one of them invited me over to Ireland and just wanted to have a long meal with me, and the meal probably cost more than I earn in a month. It was ridiculous. Bottle of wine, 1,785 euros. I remember the price because I looked at it and thought, wait a minute, where's the decimal point?
You've paid for it.
Yeah.
Inadvertently.
Actually, he told me that Angela Merkel had paid for it. Just they were being bailed out.
And Obama was listening to that, annoyed.
But then, and they are there, and they do know this is wrong, and they would like to say, and they just don't know how to do it without either losing everything financially or going to prison, or both. Because they sign the most frightening confidentiality. And there's the other. Someone at the very top of one of the big banks on Canary Wharf used to talk to me, and this person said, my family and I were moving to Brazil because Europe will never recover from its debt. And so we're off. So I enjoyed reading your blog and we're going, goodbye. And I said to her, I was so astonished. I said, but you're leaving me and my family behind with what you did. Does that not mean anything? And there was a long silence. She said, I've just got to go. And put the phone down.
And that's the hollowing out of democracy that you talk about in a very subtle way.
The hollowing out of our democracy is happening at a frightening pace under the radar. And it is happening right now. And it is much more serious than the financial crisis. Serious as the financial crisis is. But the change that is going on, the laws that are being put in place which roll back democracy is epic and frightening.
Bill of Obligations, not a Bill of Rights.
I'd like to see
a re-engagement generally because there is an alternative.
There are several.
Last point, keep thinking, keep doing it.
Yeah, I mean, do what your forebears did. Get down to the public house and have a good discussion and realise that you don't have to listen to whatever the priest is telling you. The priesthood is corrupt and stupid.
David Malone, thank you so much for being on the Renegade Economist. I hope we catch up again in the not too distant, but really thanks for your time.
It's been a pleasure, thank you.
That's it for the Renegade Economist this week. Join us again very soon. Bye.